Thank you. All right, I'm going to start us off. Good afternoon, everyone. Bienvenido. I want to thank all of you for joining us today. So this is the third of a 6-part webinar series focused on anti-racism. My name is Patricia Lopez, and I'm assistant professor in the Kremen School of Education and Human Development at Fresno State. And I'm also the director of Enseñamos en el Valle Central, which has the honor of sponsoring this webinar series. As we do in each of our webinar openings, I want to begin by acknowledging that we are in the traditional lands of the Yokuts and Mono peoples. I, along with my colleagues here today, and the CSU campuses where we all work, sit on the occupied territories of these indigenous peoples, who we all have a responsibility to recognize, including the recognition that these communities are still present and their struggle for sovereignty continues. Since many, if not all of us here today are future and current educators, I want to stress the importance of paying tribute to Native peoples and how the practice of recognition and acknowledgement of indigenous people in the ongoing process of colonization are an important part of consciousness raising and explicit expressions of anti-racism and anti-racist epistemologies. So I invite all of you who are listening, if you're on Zoom or on Facebook Live, please feel free to use the chat box to acknowledge the Native peoples whose lands you're currently occupying. And again, we welcome you. You know, in the spirit of acknowledgement and very much related to the topics that we will be discussing today, I want to also open us up with the practice of calling in a personal ancestor and honoring the knowledge and contributions that our own ancestors and ancestral lands have contributed and continue to contribute through our personal journeys. I'll briefly call in my own great-grandmother, Maria Chavez Holguin, whose lineage is rooted in the Puripechans and Tarascans people who for thousands of years have inhabited what is today called the state of Michoacan in Mexico. My great-grandmother was an artist. She was a healer. And while she had little formal education, she was vastly literate and left behind meticulously documented handwritten notes and photos of her life's journey and her wisdom. She migrated to this country in the 1930s with her 4 children and began her own lineage here in the San Joaquin Valley. And because of her journey and the journey of many others, I am here today. So these journeys of migration may also be part of your own personal experience for those of you who are here today, part of your parents, your grandparents. These journeys are complex, and it's critical for educators and non-educators to be aware of and conscious of the complexities of our own personal histories and the histories of the families and communities that we have the opportunity to serve each day. So as we ground ourselves in for today and the webinar, feel free to use a chat box, share or honor an ancestor who you're calling in to guide you today. We invite all of you to do that. And I want to welcome back those of you who are who've been joining us for webinars 1 and or 2. For those of you who are this is your first time participating in an event sponsored by Enseñamos en el Valle Central, I want to briefly share that we are a federal funded Title V initiative focused on cultivating future educators with a commitment to equity, to justice, to liberation, and to anti-racism. A very integral part of our approach to cultivating future educators, or what some refer to as growing our own, is an explicit commitment to culturally and linguistically sustaining and ethnic studies pedagogies that are grounded in anti-deficit, anti-racist, and anti-oppressive frameworks, valuing service to community, political awareness, and critical civic engagement for the public good. So the vision and principles that we uphold in this initiative are very much grounded and informed by a long history of community struggles for access to the teaching profession and an education system that reflects the racialized experiences and contributions of those it serves. A system that does away with racial, economic, and linguistic hierarchies by first acknowledging and owning the fact that they do exist. Today, our third of 6 webinar series, we believe is an example of how we put our vision and our mission into practice. So the coming together of faculty scholars and teacher education who are committed to sharing knowledge and supporting future and current educators who aspire to embody anti-racist epistemologies. So educators who strive to affirm rather than condemn difference. With that said, it's important for us to historicize the topic of anti-racism and acknowledge that this concept has deep roots in abolition. The call to end slavery and the call for structural changes in eradicating institutional racism in a post-emancipation society. These movements are very much alive today, such as we see in the Black Lives Matter movement, whereby activists and educators alike specifically and unapologetically invoke terms like abolition, anti-racist, and anti-racism to underscore the importance of individuals understanding historic and ongoing racial disparities and how these disparities are deeply rooted in power, policies, and practices. So furthermore, as we discussed in webinar 2, when we unpack the topic of anti-Black racism and anti-Blackness as a process that dehumanizes and strips Blackness of value, whereby systematically marginalizing Black people and people of African descent, I ask that you take in the words today that are shared by our panelists and also consider how these same processes find expression in our society and in turn guide systemic responses to issues like bilingualism, multilingualism, immigrant communities and undocumented communities and the treatments we put onto them. Our presenters today are also going to share how educators can not only navigate historical systems of oppression, but how to transform them both in the classroom level and within our broader communities. So today we recognize the power of educators and the possibilities of anti-racist and anti-nativist pedagogies. So on that note, let us all be inspired to think differently about how to embody and enact anti-racism in K-12 classrooms and schools. For those of you out there, if you're tweeting, we ask that you please use the Enseñamos PLC hashtag shown here on the screen, and follow and tag us on social media at FS Enseñamos. So with that, I thank you again, and I'll turn it to my colleague, Dr. Maria Goff, to transition us to our brilliant panelists today. Gracias.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lopez. I want to describe our webinar format for everyone and also introduce our wonderful panelists. So we have 3 panelists today. Each panelist will have about 15 minutes to present, and during that time you can use the chat, as many of you have already been doing. You can also submit questions. If you're on Zoom, you can use the Q&A box for questions, and if you're on Facebook Live, we'll do our best to field your questions to our panelists. And in between each of our panelists, you'll see a polling question pop up in Zoom, just asking a few questions that will guide or help our panelists with their discussion. And if you have questions for a specific panelist, please note that in your question, and the panelists will answer your questions after all 3 have presented. So I'm very happy to introduce our 3 panelists today. Our first panelist is Dr. Luiz Herrera. Dr. Herrera is an assistant professor at California State University, Fresno, in the Department of Literacy, Early, Bilingual, and Special Education. Her teaching and research centers culturally and linguistically sustaining approaches to teaching emergent bilinguals, translanguaging, critical pedagogies, and bilingual education policy. Her co-authored book, In Comunidad, Lessons for Centering the Voices and Experiences of Bilingual Latinx Students from Heinemann, came out in February 25th, 2020. Our second panelist is Dr. Michelle Soto Pena. Dr. Soto Pena is an assistant professor at California State University, Stanislaus. She is the current bilingual education coordinator for the teacher preparation program at CSU Stanislaus. As coordinator, she actively works toward building the bilingual teacher education pathways in her region. Her research interests lie in bilingual teacher preparation, bilingual biliteracy education policy, critical pedagogy, and transformative education. Her most recent work examines how teacher educators engage in reflective praxis to foster transformative learning experiences for pre-service teachers to develop and strengthen social justice dispositions. And then our third panelist is Dr. Ana Soto Lopez. Dr. Soto Lopez is an assistant professor in the Department of Literacy, Early, Bilingual, and Special Education in the Kremen School of Education and Human Development at CSU Fresno. She teaches courses on culturally sustaining pedagogy, teacher inquiry, and undocumented students. Please join me in welcoming our first panelist, Dr. Luiz Herrera.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon or good evening, and thank you so much for joining us today again. I have some slides that I'm going to pull up in a second. So just bear with me as we transition. And please answer the poll while we're waiting. So I wanted to start by introducing myself and a little bit about how I've become to embrace and continue, I think it's a continuous work to embrace my bilingual identity. And so what I've done is selected books and images, music that sort of inform this evolution or this growth, this process that again continues every single day. And I just wanted to point out a couple of these right here. The first one, and I think one of the most significant aspects that contributed to developing my bilingual identity, is the beautiful beach that you see on the left right-hand corner. That's Nayarit, the state that I'm from. And every year, for Christmas, for the holidays, we take a road trip. It would take 2 days for us to travel from LA to Nayarit. And this beach, Chacala, is one of the best sort of fondest memories from my childhood. And it was that connection to home, to my family there that, still lives there, that I was able to really maintain a solid grounding as to who I am and to really start embracing my bilingualism and my biculturalism as well. And so having that grounding and that understanding, I think really informed my path in life and what I chose in terms of my career. So of course, we're now here. But I did start out as a teacher. I began my career in New York City as a teacher there and made my way back to California after my doctoral studies. And so that's why we have a map of New York, LA, because not only was I sort of bicultural, but I was also bicoastal. So I feel like all of these things identify me and my experience and really shape my experience. And another thing that I really wanted to point out here was this oral history tape. Growing up, this was an important part of my upbringing, of my multiple literacy practices. And it was my mother telling stories and our family histories. And this was also a different way, to really ground me into who I am and to who I eventually became. And so many other texts that hopefully you recognize. All of these really have informed the way that I see myself and the way that I see the world. And so I'd like to invite you all to use the chat to share some of the texts that shaped you as an educator, or that shape you as an educator and advocate with and for emergent bilingual students. So I'd like for you to take a minute and use the chat feature to share that with us today. I see Goldie Mohammed's Cultivating Genius, absolutely. Gloria and Saldua, and we'll see a little bit more about that. Thank you, Kathy. Common, absolutely. I love, this conscious rap, hip hop. Thank you for sharing. All right, as you can continue adding, and we're going to continue moving on. All right, so today's topic is all about anti-racism and bilingual education, as well as looking at what that means for immigrant students as well, right? And when we think about bilingual, there's often an asterisk attached to this, right? And so the question that I want to, consider, that I always think about, and the question that sort of leads me through my teacher education courses and through my research and thinking is, who gets to be bilingual, and who makes that decision, right? And whose bilingual practices are often privileged, right? And so I want you to think about these questions yourselves and maybe apply them to your own lived experiences. Often in conversations with our students, future teachers, pre-service teachers, they're often very wary about claiming their bilingualism. And we have to do the work to unpack what that means and how often, because certain bilingual practices are privileged over others, our own bilingualism isn't recognized. And so I invite you today to consider these questions and really assert your bilingualism and your bilingual identity, and continue to grow your bilingual identity through being in community with others, through continuing to study and to read and to learn and to grow together with us. And I wanted to go back to Ansaldúa, which a couple of you answered, or at least one of you included in the chat. And this is one of the books that is definitely foundational to thinking about identity and language. And we include this in our book as well, because it was, again, so informative to the work that we do. And the book En Comunidad is with my co-author, Carla España, who I think is watching with us today with little Lunita. But this is an excerpt from How to Tame Wildton, one of the chapters in Borderlands La Frontera by Gloria Ansaldúa. And I just want you to maybe read along with me and go back to this question of who gets to be bilingual. I remember being caught speaking Spanish at recess. That was good for 3 licks on the knuckles with a sharp ruler. I remember being sent to the corner of the classroom for talking back to the Anglo teacher when all I was trying to do was tell her how to pronounce my name. If you want to be American, speak American. If you don't like it, go back to Mexico where you belong. I want you to speak English. Para buen trabajo tienes que saber inglés bien. Que vale toda tu educación si todavía hablas inglés con un accent. My mother would say, mortified that I spoke English like a Mexican. At Pan American University, I and all the Chicano students were required to take 2 speech classes. Their purpose? To get rid of our accents. Attacks on one's form of expression with the intent to censor are a violation of the First Amendment. El Anglo con cara de inocente nos arrancó la lengua. While tongues can't be tamed, they can only be cut out. So I want to invite you to remember the other question as well. Whose bilingualisms, bilingual practices do we privilege or get privileged? All right. And this is, just a reminder as well, right, that bilingual education is and has always been political. And the struggle for bilingual education is rooted in anti-racism. And I just want to point out a couple of these, and this is not all of the legislation that is, that really address bilingual education, but just a few of my choices. So I'm going to pick out 2 of these to tell you a little bit about them. So in 1968, the federal government passed the Bilingual Education Act. And this was the first legislative move by the federal government that actually recognized the needs of emerging bilingual children, which the federal government called limited English proficient, and still calls them that today. Specifically, it provided funding for research, for training staff, for the development of bilingual programs or support in the home language. But it's really important to note, though, that the BEA was only made possible by the efforts from the civil rights movement. And it's just a really good place to remind everybody that bilingual education is tied intrinsically to Black liberation. And it's important to realize, for all of us to realize, the connections between the various struggles, right? So between the struggle for Black liberation and linguistic oppression, to the persecution of immigrant communities, and the persecution of indigenous and other people of color. Another proposition or another legislation I want to point out, which is California specific, is 227. And that's the one that I grew up in because I grew up in California. Prop 227 was the English only education policy, which we had in place for about 20 years and was only reversed recently by Prop 58. So now we have an increasing expansion of bilingual education across the state. But for about 20 years, there was a concerted effort, which was successful, right, to eliminate bilingual education. So again, bilingual education has always been political. So what is an anti-racist bilingual education? And I wanted to talk about what that looks like to me and some of the frameworks that really shape this view and some of the frameworks that really guide my own research and my writing, as well as my teaching. And so I wanted to point out three major frameworks that guide me. So Translanguaging by Ofelia Garcia, Culturally Sustaining Pedagogies by Permissive, and Racial Linguistic Perspectives by Nelson Flores, and Jonathan Rosa. And at the end, I'll give you a reference list so you can look these up as well, all right? But what is anti-racist bilingual education and what might it look like, right? So an anti-racist bilingual education looks at language from a sociolinguistic perspective. So what does that mean? Well, it considers language or looks at language by how it's actually being used by the community. It considers the context specifics of the language practices and builds from there. It also views students as co-learners and language experts of their own linguistic practices. So in education spaces, it's often a space where a very top-down approach kind of learning happens. But an anti-racist bilingual education views students as co-learners, like I said. Students are open and seen as the language experts that they are. They can contribute to the teaching and learning, especially when it comes to their home language experiences and their lived experiences as well. And anti-racist bilingual education also recognizes that bilingualism exists in the continuum, right? A lot of people don't want to claim their bilingualism because they don't feel that they've become proficient enough in one language or the other. And it's important to do away with those harmful notions and consider that bilingualism exists on a continuum and you're always acquiring and developing language. And one more thing, it exists at the intersection of, like I said, translanguaging, racial linguistic perspectives, which I'll talk a little bit about and a little bit more about, and culturally sustaining pedagogies. And finally, it rejects the reproduction of racial and linguistic hierarchies. And I wanted to point out this quote from Nelson Flores' most recent work, in which he argues that bilingual education started as a grassroots movement from very community-led, focused work. And so it moved from that to actually, became part of more of the power structure. And so as the quote here says, and I'm just going to read the emphasis here, the emphasis shifted instead to sharing professional expertise about the value of education. So went from a community-led work to really focusing on looking at the value of bilingual education from a different perspective. So he argues, and this is from an upcoming book that he's working on, that there have been efforts to institutionalize bilingual education that has actually taken away from this grassroots sort of origins that bilingual education had or has. And in thinking about what anti-racism looks like in bilingual education, I wanted to share 4 guiding principles for teaching bilingual Latinx students. And this is from Carla España in my book, En Comunidad. So I wanted to just point out a couple of these. So the first principle is practice a pedagogy that is constantly in self-reflection of language ideologies. And this is something that I do and that we do with our teacher, pre-service and in-service teachers. What are some of the, and just like I had you all think about, right? What are some texts that sort of guide you? I asked students to think about their experiences, their literacy practices, their upbringing, everything that shapes them, because that is going to shape how they see or how they think about language and their children's language practices. Another one that I wanted to point out is the second practice, which is practice a pedagogy that focuses on unlearning the notions of linguistic supremacy, right? Which also includes unlearning purist ideologies surrounding Spanish language, which we are very well aware of. For instance, it could show up in the Spanish varieties that hold power and privilege in our Latinx communities, including the monolingual language practices that are often informed in schools, for example, in bilingual programs or dual immersion programs that reject the bilingual language practices of the bilingual Latinx community, so like translanguaging. And so I wanted to just give you a preview of some of the major assignments for one of my teacher education courses that is aligned with this, right? To get students to think about their own bilingualism, to get them to do some sort of inquiry projects with their own students, for students to think about their own language and culture stories. And finally, to plan the lessons, the teaching and learning that are anchored in this learning, as well as the 3 T's, which I'm going to share next. And these are just some examples of some of the student work that I've had from the autobiografías. I'm kind of running out of time, so I'm just going to go through quickly. But I wanted to share this also from Español en Herrera. So topic, text, and translanguaging. This is one of the ways, like sometimes, you know, we think about what does this look like, right? What does anti-racist bilingual education look like in the classroom? And so one way that we can do this is to plan instruction using the 3 T's, or really anchored in what we call the 3 T's: topics, text, and translanguaging. And what do we mean by topics? We mean topics that are culturally and linguistically sustaining, texts that are in solidarity with our students' bilingual Latinx identities or bilingual identities, and translanguaging, creating those spaces in the classroom for students to use their home language or their entire linguistic repertoire that includes features from their home languages. And one definition of translanguaging that we often use is translanguaging, thinking about it in 3 ways, right? As the bilingual language practices of students or children, of all of us, as a pedagogical approach. So how do you actually create translanguaging spaces in your teaching, in the teaching and teaching and learning, and also translanguaging for social justice. So by creating these spaces, by opening up the classroom as a place where students can bring their whole selves in, right? That is social justice in education. So I really like this definition of translanguaging, looking at it, you know, as from these 3 different ways, or in 3 different ways. And so I want you to think about what might anti-racist pedagogy look like if we consider the 3 T's. And I'm going to give you a few examples, and maybe you can also think about some as well. So one topic you might want to address is chasing our dreams and finding a sense of belonging. A text that can support that topic and can sustain student identities, right? It could be Dreamers by Juji Morales. For translanguaging, students can turn and talk using any language or their entire linguistic repertoire. They can annotate using their entire linguistic repertoire, right? They can write their own books, also using features from all of their repertoire as well. And this is in Spanish. The topic, sintiendo las diferentes emociones y sentimientos en un nuevo hogar. The text could be Mi diario de aquí hasta allá, My diary from here to there, by Amada Irma Perez. For translanguaging, similarly, you can have student groups, small groups, or partners turn and talk, right? Or work together using all of their linguistic repertoire. Make annotations in any language as well. And finally, this is what it might look like for, I don't know, middle school, maybe upper elementary school. So the topic, understanding what's happening with detained children at the border, right? So the text you could use could be this New York Times video where children are actually reading testimonies of other children that have been detained and that are in detention camps. An article on Nucella that talks about the policies that support this. And for translanguaging, again, students can read, annotate. They can access this article in Spanish and English, so they could have both. They can read and write in all of using their entire linguistic repertoire. So I invite you to now use the chat to think about, what this might look like in your classroom or an idea that you might have when considering topics, text, and translanguaging. All right, thank you so much. I'm going to hand it off now to my colleague, Dr. Michelle Soto Pena. And also for those of you who respond to the survey, we do have 2 books to give away. So I have them here and I will send them to you wherever you are.
Thank you, Dr. Herrera. So as I transition to my presentation, I am both excited and energized to expand on her work and thinking about what does it look like at a macro level. I apologize for the lighting. COVID is a real thing, and so I'm in the only room where my child cannot get to. So I apologize for the view. Let's see if I can share my screen. There we go. All right, so great. So I'm going to go ahead and start my presentation also by centering my positionality, which I like to define as in community. So I am Puerto Rican and Salvadorian. They say of descent, but I claim those nationalities because I see them as very contextual to my identity. I was born and raised in Southern California, but I also similarly consider myself living in the borderland. So in the center picture, you'll see a small little fragment of my very large family, which is the reason why I do what I do. I would say that I am in this position of education, specifically bilingual education, not by choice, but by force of the universe, only because I have spent my entire lifetime running away of the concept of continuous education and running away of the concept of working within the field of education because of my own personal educational experiences. And so a lot of times teachers will be asked of their story of when did you know you wanted to be a teacher? Or when did you know you wanted to join the field of education? And I always in my lifetime have heard the stories of, oh, when I was little and I was a teacher and I was sharing. And for me, I always tell my colleagues, like, I specifically remember when I didn't want to be a teacher, and it was in 6th grade, and I was counting down how many years I had left to never go back to school. And simultaneously also making sure I never raised my hand when teachers solicited a student poll of how many wanted to be a teacher growing up. And so from one way to another, I found myself in education. And the big reason behind that is because I feel that being a teacher and being education is being an organizer in a social movement. And so when I really learned how to learn and learned how to be a teacher, it was really when I was a teacher. And if you see in the top left-hand corner, this is my education family. The first school that I was placed in or I got an opportunity to work in I stayed there until I decided to leave, and they are my teachers. They continue to be my teachers, and they're also my family. And so fast track forward, as I went back to school, I decided not to teach simultaneously. And I became really involved in a lot of policy networks when it specifically looked at language education across the state of California. And so the second family that I have developed over the years is my LE family, which you'll see on the top right-hand corner, which is a sub-organization related to or in connection to Californians Together and California Association of Bilingual Education. And I'll talk a little bit about the work they've done in the state of California to hopefully inspire those of you who are out of state to see how a lot of policy and practice gets pushed throughout the state. So my presentation is going to be really looking at examining the relationships between bilingual education policy and practice. So Dr. Herrera shared a lot of great examples of what anti-racist transformative education can look like in the classroom context. Unfortunately, that is very few and far between that we see within the classroom practice. So I am geographically situated in the Central Valley, where we do have a plethora amount of bilingual education programs. However, each way in which practice is put into place varies. And it varies by policy and by the socio-political context that informs that policy. So I first want to talk a little bit about the historical tensions that we can find within bilingual education. And I'm looking at this, there's a great article by Ovando, 2003, that is a really comprehensive paper that looks at language policy, and he's written it in the form of a literature review. So there is a great starting point of the literature that looks at policy and the development of bilingual education across the US. But since this paper was written in 2003, there's been a lot of change, especially in California from 2003 forward. And so I'm going to talk a little bit of what that looks like now. So what he did is he separated and parsed out the history of bilingual education across 4 different periods of time. The first period of time that he defines as the permissive period. And he argues that this actually takes place between the 1700s and the 1880s. And this is a time where you really have settler colonialism come into play, where folks are not claiming their regions yet, but they're living in cultural enclaves, and therefore all languages are accepted. What this does ignore is the native languages and the indigenous peoples of the Americas. And so this literature review does not really tap into that piece until he gets to the restrictive period. So I don't want to dilute the fact that it doesn't happen at the inception of settler colonialism. But in this paper, what he talks and describes of is a lot of European nations coming into the United States, finding their space or their region and existing within their own cultural enclave. And so you'll find diversity of language within these communities, from schools to businesses to legal documents. However, then the pendulum takes a shift into this restrictive period, where in this restrictive period, it really is a very intensified moment of assimilation and linguistic power. So this is a very English-only dominated space. And it's in this period where you will find those American Indian boarding schools, where there is both linguistic, cultural, and actual genocide of indigenous peoples and indigenous languages. You will actually find a lot of legal documentation working towards having English-only narratives, English-only tests. So during this time, you'll find the Naturalization Act of 1906, for example, where all legal documents were written in the English language, and therefore to become a US citizen, you had to speak the English language. And then there's also federal aid that was given to a lot of schools and districts across the US, but that federal aid was specifically for the funding of schools who were very intentional in teaching the English language exclusively. So during this period of time, you see a rise of English immersion, the sink and swim models. And I say that because it's important to understand how we teach our students isn't informed in the beginning by research, it's really informed by policy. And that policy is shifted by public sentiment. So the sentiment during this piece was of this American essentialism, this naturalization of this is American English only, pushed by those in power. Then going into the opportunist period, the reason why I think this is called the opportunist period is because it was the time in which there was folks using opportunities to then advocate for bilingual education. And so what do I mean by that? During the opportunist period, we'll see an expansion of bilingual education. But the expansion actually happens during the Cold War when they realized that there was no linguistic diversity and therefore they couldn't have spies going into other countries to be able to get intel. So what they created was a lot of government programs to teach other languages so that then they can have a sophisticated intel operative system. However, simultaneously, as the US government is working out this way of creating opportunity to really expand and compete in this global market and global community, we have grassroots efforts taking advantage of the laws and the opportunities that were created to say, okay, well, we need to expand bilingual education. And so during this time, you'll see a lot of folks from the bottom up pushing for asset-oriented education. And so this is where you're going to see an onslaught of different language policies that were described by Dr. Herrera, where we have the Civil Rights Act, the Immigration Act, and the first dual immersion school that came out during this period of time. We have the Bilingual Education Act and then Lau v. Nichols, which was a case that then pretty much put into policy that equity did not mean equal, right? So this case was in San Francisco, where we see a group of Chinese community members and families advocate for bilingual education, saying that their children cannot access the material being taught in English because that wasn't their dominant language. And so by law, policy was created that forced schools and districts to then provide equitable, not equal, equitable access to education. Then we had in 1981, for example, the Castaneda-Pickard standard that then said, okay, having a law talking about equity isn't enough. There needs to be standards to ensure that these are quality education programs. So during this opportunist period, there was a push not only to have bilingual education, to have equitable education for all students despite their background, but then it also pushed to make sure that it's high quality education and that districts and schools were being held accountable. However, I mean, good things never last that long, I guess, right? So we go back into this dismissive period, and Dr. Herrera talks a lot about Prop 227 during the dismissive period, and I similarly am and I forgot to talk about this in my positionality, but I feel like I am a product of 227, where in the state of California, they, over the 80s, when Reagan was the governor, no, he wasn't the governor. When Reagan was the governor, not in the 80s, he allowed a lot of these propositions to sunset, meaning that the open and the access and the support for bilingual education ended within a legal sense. And so that led way and paved the way for laws to come through that had a deficit orientation. So Prop 227 was one of them, where it was called English for the Children. It was led by Ron Unz. And Unz worked to essentially get rid of bilingual education and eliminate bilingual education altogether. And so, oh, I apologize. Oh, I'm jumping ahead of myself. And so during this piece, it was a systematic dismantling of bilingual education, where actually the sentiment of the community was very anti-immigrant. Simultaneously, Prop 187 came into play, which was very anti-immigrant and not allowing undocumented immigrants access healthcare, emergency healthcare within the state of California. Fortunately, that didn't get passed, but unfortunately, Prop 227 did. So what that required is, rather than having an open door access for students who were designated as English language learners, be automatically matriculated to bilingual education programs and then transitioned into English immersion. So building on their native language to then facilitate the development of a second language. What we saw was that parents had a series of hoops or roadblocks to overcome. So we saw parents that needed to sign waivers, so that as some school districts systematically didn't give out waivers anymore. And then from those waivers, they had to be repeated, right? And then you needed a certain amount of parents to be at a certain school site. And so essentially, because of the hoops and the barriers put into place, there became an elimination of bilingual education. And so the question is, how do we define our current linguistic period? So this literature review ended in 2003. And the idea is that, okay, well, we're not against bilingual ed, but we're not for bilingual ed, but the policy is really systemically working against bilingual education. And what I do want to, and what I talked about was that interconnection between how does that inform classroom, district, school, or state. So if we at a state have a proposition that says if you're identified as an English learner, you must be enrolled in an English immersion school setting unless your parent specifically tells the district that you need to be in a bilingual setting, the district then has the choice to then look into options to see how bilingual schools are created, right? So essentially, that can inform the way the school is structured, meaning what type of learning experiences students receive. And this all is interconnected. However, what I do like to share is that even though we have this dismissive period, 20 years of deficit-oriented language policies that created roadblocks for students who were identified as language learners, English language learners, from entering bilingual education settings, we also have a movement and a grassroots efforts of folks trying to reclaim and regain that bilingual education. And so I had made a note for one of, I haven't been looking at the chat, I apologize. So I will definitely catch up on that. But during Dr. Herrera's time, I had read a chat by Peggy Helmquist, and she had asked about, okay, well, what does this access mean for Black students as well? So it goes into how I'm seeing the shift in this 20-year period of bilingual education programs. Who has access to these programs? And so because it hasn't been a statewide effort of creating access to programs, it's been working at a local level. So then the question goes to who has knowledge of these systems that can then pressure those in power to create this access. And so of the bilingual schools that I have observed and seen, most of them have been started by parents who have power, who know how to navigate the system, who are high SES, that may understand and utilize language as another asset to compete in the global market. And so if we don't have parents that understand and know that agency, then the access is then further limited. And so in this grassroots effort that I'm talking about, in that one of that LE family that I'm a part of, one thing that I've learned and then also integrated within is the grassroots effort of how to bring back bilingual education. So the state of California specifically tried to attempt to overturn 227, but the governors have either vetoed the idea of having a representation of the seal, or voters were not in a position to do so. So what they decided to do is, well, let's start at a school level and let's start at a district level. And so rather than saying schools have to be bilingual education, why don't we have high schools provide a seal of biliteracy when they graduate high school, saying that these students have several different assets, one of them being a multilingual asset. And so what started out as a way of acknowledging the linguistic assets of students exploded. So then now we see, if you look at the chart on the right, these are all of the states that have adopted the model, the seal of biliteracy, after the state of California had got it started. And so the most current, we have about 402 districts in the state of California. 321 school districts recognize and give a seal of biliteracy, and 99 are left within our state to offer. However, because this is grassroots and it's localized, the way in which it's implemented varies. So you'll have some districts that start the seal of biliteracy from pre-kinder, so early childhood education, and pipeline it all the way through up to high school, while you'll have other school districts that might start at high school. In my particular area, I have heard stories of districts who, even though you have a student who is a native language speaker of that target language, is forced to take remedial language courses in addition to ELD courses, to be able to get that seal, even though they have the linguistic repertoire to do so. Whereas there may be other students who don't have those same linguistic skills and are put in the same track. So there's an inequitable implementation of the seal of biliteracy. But I do want to credit CalTOG for Californians Together for being the organization to work and collaborate as a consortium of organizations to work towards really getting the ball started for the seal of biliteracy. And so when there was that asset-oriented lens for bilingual education, then what we noticed is that there was more of a buy-in, right? More of a buy-in for bilingual education. So the more districts that normalize this concept of a seal of biliteracy, they then began to be empathetic to the concept of course we want to be bilingual because we want to compete in the global market, right? So also keep in mind where the rationale behind biliteracy is right now in our context. And so taking advantage of that piece, so it passed in 2016 with 73.52% of the constituency. Right after, in 2018, there was also a working group that worked to create an EL roadmap. So we know that when we use terminology like English learners, it's already taking a deficit standpoint. But if you read into this document, what's really interesting is that from a systems-wide approach, you'll see that they're really working to create systems change for schools to say, you need to find a way to value the linguistic and cultural assets of students, particularly those of more marginalized populations. And so what I would say Prop 58 coupled with the EL roadmap is from a policy perspective, working to really create systems changes at a district level. 2017, they then said, okay, well, if we have students that are going through this DLA process, but then they still have to take standardized tests in English, it's creating inequities because when we're looking at a linguistic repertoire, we might be more dominant in one language versus the other, depending on the type of schooling we receive. So, and we would like content areas to be assessed in Spanish. So they have developed and piloted it and are starting implementation phase of what that proposed Spanish assessment looks like between 2020 and 2021. Because of COVID, I don't know where we're at right now. And then simultaneously, before Tom Torlakson left office as a state superintendent, he proposed a plan and initiative called the Global 2030, which really calls for at least 1,600 schools in the state of California to be dual language schools. So the goal is not just stopping with the policies that are getting passed, but having the goal for districts to really take a critical eye and looking how they can expand bilingual education. So then that question then goes into, I'm going to just take a quick scan of the chat. Oh yes, let's go ahead and work on this poll. So can you take the poll, for those of you trying to attain your bilingual authorization, have you received the formal education in target language? Mark all that apply. And the reason why I wanted to poll you all on this is because now you've seen systematically how schooling has happened, right? Have you had the privilege, what I would consider a privilege, to be schooled in a bilingual education setting? Or have you had the need to reclaim language? So I was pushed into an English-only and English immersion school setting by well-intentioned parents who also felt that English was the only way to raise me at that period of time. So I've spent my lifetime reclaiming my mother tongue. And so having that positionality also makes me empathetic to a new wave of students who have the linguistic abilities and capabilities to be bilingual educators, but systematically have been told that they don't have the skills set to do so. And so, great, so we can see, and so, great. So then, let me go ahead and share these results. So here you can see there's 10 of 36 participants that attended DLI schools, 9 of 36 that have their seal of biliteracy, 6 and 5, great, formalized language. And then 9 that have had language instruction in another country. So it varies. And so I think we need to be cognizant of the variance of our students, right? Oh, there isn't an option for none. Okay, well, thank you, Sandy. That's true, I didn't put in an option for none. So feel free to write in the chat if you haven't and that you have gained that linguistic ability through like family or other means. So given this need, there's going to be an expansion of bilingual education because of the policies that are put into place. And I want us to keep in mind that these policies weren't an easy like, oh, this is a good idea because research says bilingual education improves the cognitive flexibility of our students. Oh, this is a good thing because research says bilingual education improves the cross-cultural competency of our students. These policies don't come into place because they're saying that, oh, we want our students to be linguistically diverse, right? Or we want them to have these assets to be able to connect to the global community. These policies came into place because there was a grassroots efforts of people pushing that into place, pressuring schools, pressuring districts, pressuring policymakers to write into law by force that they have to adhere to creating learning environments that are inclusive, that draw on the funds of knowledge and the assets of our students. And so as we have these changes happening at the K-12 level, there's a whole nother system that works in another silo, which is the institutions of higher education. And so in that silo, we will see where we have to prepare our bilingual teacher educators. So the question is, where in the state of California, we have a set of standards that bilingual teachers or all teachers need to follow. Bilingual education follows and adheres to the same TPEs as as English, immersion, mainstream English teachers teach. And so I wanted to take an example. And so if you are a credential candidate, I want you to actually look at the TPEs and follow this exercise. Highlight what you think matches and says, oh, I totally see this linking with the bilingual pedagogy and practice that I'm learning in my courses, or this kind of conflicts with the language and the concepts that I'm learning. And so I'll show you what that means. So here we have TPE 1, engaging and supporting all students in learning. And so in the first TPE, the green that I highlight is what I felt aligned with what we see with bilingual education. So for example, funds of knowledge, cultural language. So we build on students' funds of knowledge, like how Dr. Herrera has showed. How do we build on their experiences, build on their interests, build on their culture? Then we're creating inclusive learning experiences for our students. Provide supportive learning environment for students' first and or second language acquisition by using research-based instructional approaches. So we just had a whole presentation from Dr. Herrera about research-based instructional approaches of how to support the development of bilingualism and biliteracy, right? So those are things that are explicitly connected to bilingual education. However, if we continue forward reading the yellow pieces, then we'll see focused English language development, specifically designated academic instruction in English, scaffolding across content areas, and structured English immersion. So here we'll see the entire yellow component is focused on English language acquisition. So already TPE 6, although it refers to using 2 languages, is actually built to obtain and sustain the English language, right? And so really, what does that mean for our credential candidates? It means that our credential candidates are put in between a rock and a hard spot. Are we trying to prepare them for bilingual education? Or are we trying to prepare them to sustain the English dominant, English immersion, assimilative type of education models that existed during the Prop 227 era? And what I would argue is the latter. Because what we really need to do is we need to have our own separate, if not completely revamp the TPEs so that it's not pushing just an English-only narrative, but it's pushing a linguistically diverse narrative that's building and sustaining the linguistic backgrounds of our students. And that's inclusive of the argument between standard and non-standard English as well, because we're looking at linguistic colonialism, when we're judging students on the concepts of standard versus non-standard language, right? So if you're a teacher educator, you're gonna be, or not teacher educator, if you are a credential candidate, I don't blame you if you're confused of what do I do and how do I get out of this program successfully, because your bilingual teachers are probably teaching you anti-racist decolonial pedagogies as it relates to bilingual education, but by law, everyone who's assessing you is looking to see how are you teaching students English and what pedagogies are you putting into place that it's focused specifically and narrowly on English. And so then let's go into this TPA. So in order to assess TPEs, we have these TPAs within the state of California. And in education, we always say, what's your objective? Then create your assessment, and then the learning experience is gonna align to that assessment. Well, here's the assessment we're having our teacher educators do. If we look at a 2-cycle assessment, we can see what are their options if you're a bilingual teacher. If you're a bilingual teacher, and this is from the CCTC in 2019, your options, if you want to have a literacy lesson for cycle 1, is to teach ELD, right? Doesn't matter your language of instruction, you need to figure out how you're going to teach ELD, right? If you're teaching math in the content, by the way, you need to incorporate ELD. So what's unique to the context of California is that San Diego County Office of Education actually took the initiative to look at the Common Core state standards, look at the English language development standards, and then create a parallel document for Spanish language development and for Common Core in Espanol. And then also integrating the nuances and variances and differences that would be required to teach students if they're teaching in the Spanish target language. But nowhere do we see that in cycle 1 or cycle 2. Rather, what we see is an overemphasis of English language development standards, regardless of it being in a bilingual education context. And this document was specifically written for bilingual education candidates. Single subject also follows a similar suit. So the question then goes to, how do we pass? How do we pass these TPAs if I'm being trained in one thing, but then being assessed in another? And this is one thing that I struggle with daily, where I continue to advocate. I talk to the CCTC, I talk to the networks I'm in, I talk to the program standard, I'm on a working group for program standards, and I make this very apparent of the disconnect between the assessments and the standards that are put into place for teacher education and the pedagogies and practices of what the research actually says for bilingual education. And so what I would argue is 2 things. As a bilingual credential candidate, what you have to do is you have to be able to do a code switch of policy in your mind. You have to be able to first think about, this is what I'm going to do to pass a test, knowing that it may not be the same thing that you're doing to create a linguistically diverse and culturally inclusive and racially inclusive environment within your classroom context. And so moving forward, this is a really cool text, Rethinking Bilingual Education, but moving forward, what I would argue that you do is inform yourself and inform others. So stay abreast with all the policies coming into place, because that's going to impact the way you teach. Disrupt linguistic assimilation. You're going to go into a school district that is not going to be mirroring the messaging you're getting in your credential program. So it's your role and responsibility to disrupt it, challenge the deficit constructs that you see, and then push the community for more bilingual education, especially if you're in the Central Valley, which is the region where I'm sitting right now. Although we call for bilingual ed, not all districts are open to bilingual ed, so we need to create those spaces for that. And get connected. So here are several different organizations within the state of California and then also across the US that you can get involved with that work specifically towards either abolitionist education, anti-racist education, or bilingual education. And just a little plug-in, Alas y Voz campaign, I'm really a firm believer in plugging with families and communities. And so that's a campaign that you can share with community members, particularly parents, to start pressuring schools and districts to have bilingual education programs in their school districts.
Dr. Soto Lopez, you're on mute right now.
Thank you. So I was reading the poll question, right? How many US citizen children under 18 have a parent or relative that is undocumented? It looks like 44% of you said 6 million, and I will be giving you that answer shortly. So let me move this. And thank you to my colleagues, Dr. Herrera and Soto Pena, for sharing a lot of really valuable information that I hope those of you that are listening in will walk away with some new knowledge today. So good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us today. My name is Ana Soltero Lopez, and I'm an assistant professor and the Bilingual Authorization Program Coordinator at Fresno State, where I primarily teach in the multiple subject credential program. So today I'll be speaking about anti-racist nativist pedagogy and undocumented immigrant education. So I want to start by sharing my testimonial with you. I migrated to the US from Guadalajara, Mexico at the age of 2. The picture you see on the screen was taken the night before I crossed the border. I first became aware of my undocumented status in elementary school as a result of California's Prop 187, which sought to regulate social services, quote unquote, for illegal aliens. Under this proposition, teachers were mandated to report suspected undocumented children and families to then INS, or today USCIS. Prop 187 was ruled unconstitutional, but the impact of its xenophobia drastically shifted my social skills and academic performance. Before Prop 187, I was a highly talkative and engaged student, but the moment my mom cautioned me that deportation was a consequence of saying too much, I became fearful and untrusting of everyone, keeping to myself and speaking as little as possible. Fortunately, I became a permanent resident my senior year of high school, but sadly, my personal and professional struggle fighting against draconian immigration laws and policies continues to this day. To be honest, for the last few days, I went back and forth about deciding to share my testimonial so publicly. The painful realization I had is that decades later, I continue to struggle with the long-lasting effects of the shame I internalized about my undocumented status. Today, we continue to see overt racist and nativist attacks as evidenced by anti-Blackness, Islamophobia, statelessness of refugees, and the continued threat of ending the DACA program. So I want to share some data with you, right? And going back to the poll there's an estimated 11.3 million undocumented immigrants in our country today. 8 million have at least one family member who is undocumented. 6 million US citizen children under the age of 18 have a parent or relative that is undocumented. 1.8 undocumented immigrants are under the age of 18, and we presently have 680,000 DACA beneficiaries. And slightly over 850,000 apprehensions occurred at the US-Mexico border between October 2018 and September 2019, the highest annual level in 12 years. And then almost 2,000 children were separated from an adult between April 2018 and May 2018. This was a 6-week window. So to understand racist nativism, we must critically understand the social construction of race, racism, and the racial hierarchies that result. We must understand how and why these become legitimized. We must then understand that, like racism, nativist views are rooted in similar beliefs of otherness. Illegality is also a social construct that regards immigrant bodies as un-American, dispensable, disposable, and deportable. Racist nativism contends that the legacy of white supremacy is the disease, and racist nativism a symptom of that disease. So how can you enact anti-racist nativist pedagogy? Well, first we have to stop associating an undocumented status to Mexicans. Latinx people in general, but Mexicans in particular, continue to be scapegoated, when in reality we know that the undocumented population in our country is not homogeneous. We must also stop vilifying immigrants, refugees, and parents. While the undocumented youth movement celebrates the resiliency and the American upbringing of these youth, it does so at the expense of the valiant parents whose desire for a better life becomes criminalized. We must also stop pretending that this issue is not affecting our students today. The social inequities that currently plague our society are being discussed in homes. For families of color, these conversations are cautionary in nature, as it was in my case. It should sadden us to learn that parents of color have to warn their children about the outside world because of their skin color, their language, their religion, and immigration status. What we need to do is start educating ourselves about social, political, and educational inequities and start collaborating with our students' families. Validating their and our students' stories and emotions is crucial. Social emotional learning is a sexy topic in schools today, just as we're emphasizing the importance of giving space to discuss the impact of COVID-19. We must also provide space to discuss the concurrent pandemics of anti-Black racism, xenophobia, Islamophobia, and other isms and phobias. So on that note, I want to share a text with you that is so timely, and it's titled, "When a Bully Becomes President, Truth and Creativity for Oppressive Times." I like this book because it addresses the topics of bullying, colonization, and slavery in a kid-friendly way. There's also the copy that I have, my personal copy, and the one I'm displaying here is actually a bilingual copy. But most importantly, it is encouraging and uplifting by emphasizing that by uniting for truth, respect, and love, children can make a difference, especially in this divisive time. So I want to share some ideas for using this text in primary grades. But first, I want to say that we should not treat children as passive learners. For the reasons I mentioned earlier, children are reading the world and making sense of it. Using this book, you can create relevant and engaging lessons using multimodal text. So for example, your students can make a text-to-self connection based on the themes that emerge from the book for them. You can also have them make a text-to-text connection by using maps, such as the ones provided by UC Berkeley's Interdisciplinary Migration Initiative, which maps in the state of California the health and legal clinics provided. You can also use music videos and lyrics about immigration, like Aloe Black's Wake Me Up and Calle 13's Pal Norte. Children can also make text-to-world connections by using documentaries about children refugees in Syria, as an example, and other parts of the world. Another idea is that is encouraged in this book is having children publish their own stories. And that's absolutely what I love, right, about this particular book, but also highly encouraged within our teacher education program. And I'll share the link to that when I'm finished presenting. I'll throw those in the chat. But all of these ideas lend themselves to state standards focused on activating prior knowledge, compare and contrasting, making predictions, determining a theme, describing the character, and so on. So here are more children's texts that I want to share. As an example, Mama's Nightingale is about family separation in a Haitian family. Daya's Story Cloth is a Hmong migration story. And A Brothers in Hope is about the Sudan Civil War and its refugees. And you can also find kind of the equivalent young adult novels and do write similar assignments for the upper grade levels. And here are just some resources if you want to kind of be informed in terms of undocumented immigrant support organizations. I'll go ahead and throw these in the chat as well. There's a few there, and then I'll throw in the chat the teaching resources that I just mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all of our panelists, and we invite you to submit your questions using the Q&A in Zoom, and also if you are on Facebook Live, you can submit your questions there and we'll convey those to the panelists. So we have quite a few good questions for all of you to think about and answer. One of the consistent questions we've got, and maybe Dr. Soto Lopez, you can address this now as our new BAP coordinator, is how do our guests here go about earning a BAP? What's the process for that, and maybe what resources should they look into?
Thank you, Dr. Hoff. So that's an excellent question. First, I want to encourage all of you to email me because we know that many of you are in different stages in your academic career. So some of you, particularly if you are a liberal studies student, you're not yet in our credential program, please connect with me. You should be taking those courses now. If you are a current student in our credential program, email me because there's ways that I can, working with you, I can figure out a way to support you, right, in being able to complete that BAP authorization. But please email me, right, because every situation is very unique, and without kind of knowing where you are, it's hard for me to say. Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. And I'll put my email on the chat as well.
So I know, I want to just add, because I know one of the questions was from a student at Cal Poly Pomona, so not one of our own students. And so I would encourage you to talk to your bilingual program coordinator and make sure that you're taking some of those courses towards the BAP now. But hopefully it won't be too late once you get into the credential program. That's one of the reasons, we've had to address some of the structural issues, right? But make sure that you connect with your bilingual program coordinator to make sure that you're on the right track and taking the courses that you need for your BAP. You can also get the bilingual authorization through CSET, but of course we would always encourage you to go through coursework as well.
Thank you. We had a comment in the chat that was interesting. I wanted to share with all of the panelists, and you can kind of address this comment and see what you all think. So one of our attendees asked, I question whether our districts, our employers have moved far enough from an English-only model of the last 20 years. I have had people in power talk about, quote unquote, productive struggle as a way to not scaffold and not support. This language has even crept into the language of evaluative, punitive, really, tools to walk classrooms. This isn't a question of, quote unquote, tough love. It's about lack of administrative knowledge and not honoring home language and home culture.
I guess I can start. We have not moved from an English-only approach, right? So I think the legacy of 227 continues to this day. There are, of course, efforts statewide to increase bilingual programming across the state. One of those examples, or one of those efforts, can be, for instance, currently I'm the professor in residence for the bilingual residency program at Madeira, so the Madeira Teacher Residency Program, which is specifically designed to support the development of bilingual teachers. And so I know that the state has allocated funding specifically to develop teacher residencies that focus on bilingual education or developing bilingual teachers. So there are some efforts, but it is still mostly an English-only approach in education. Anybody else want to add to that? Maybe Michelle or Anna?
Yeah, I can add, there was a really, I'll look it up right now, but if you go onto the SEAL webpage for Loyola Marymount University, they came out with a recent document that surveyed districts across the state, asking them about their expectations for bilingual teacher educators. And one interesting finding that emerged from that document, and wasn't intended really to be a point of focus, is that there are really high expectations, right? That idea of productive struggle, but with our bilingual educators, right? They're the ones who are starting the program, leading the program, and developing the programs within districts, but there's no professional guidance or support. And so what's interesting is that if we really want to support our teachers, then we need to carry that same model that we hold for our students. Our students, the expectation isn't that they're going to just float into learning and by osmosis gain this knowledge, skills, and practicum, but it's more of how do we provide those systems of support. In my own research, looking specifically at culturally sustaining pedagogies within teachers and bilingual settings, one thing that a lot of teachers came out with was, I have a whole bunch of professional development on strategies to teach language. I don't even know where to start when it comes to culturally sustaining pedagogies or anti-racist teaching. And so that's something else that I think needs to be intentional. If not, like this webinar is a good start, I think there needs to be more spaces that really intentionally engage in anti-racist pedagogical teaching within bilingual settings.
Thank you. Sorry, I just lost our question. So Michelle, you briefly answered this in the chat, but this is stemming off of that question. So related to that, do administrator preparation programs include mandatory coursework on bilingual, anti-racist, culturally responsive education? And so some people might not have been able to see, Michelle, your answer, if you want to go ahead and address that for the group, and then Anna and Luiz, if you want to talk about that as well.
Sure. I mean, I can only speak from my personal experience, and I would love to see if there's any opportunities at Fresno State to see what that looks like. But through my own experiences, I wouldn't say that anti-racism and culturally sustaining pedagogies is centered within, or bilingual education centered within administrative preparation programs. I think that there are individuals who are passionate about these concepts and therefore integrated into their leadership, but I wouldn't say it's a centerfold of admin preparation. I know that there have been conversations of looking at specific bilingual education administrative credentials or a certificate on top of credential at CSU San Diego and CSU San Marcos. To the extent to which they fully develop those programs, I'm not sure.
I'm wondering if you can repeat that question, Dr. Goff. I'm sorry. I want to make sure that I get it right.
Sure, absolutely. So do administrator preparation programs include mandatory coursework on bilingual, anti-racist, culturally responsive education?
That's a good question. I'm not, most of the work that I do is for pre-service teachers, as well as for master's students obtaining their master's in multilingual, multicultural education. And so that not specifically for administrators, so I wouldn't know how to answer that question actually. But yeah.
I'll just add in really quick, just the states, the tier 1 administrative credential that current teachers would come back to obtain that. I think you're right across the board, Dr. Soto Pena. The tier 1 credential standards don't censor these things. That doesn't mean that programs may not attend to them, which I think, those are program by program and local decisions, but as a state set of standards, the administrative tier 1 credentials don't do that. So it's a great question.
Thank you. Another question we have, and this again is open to everyone of our panelists, and even Dr. Lopez, if you want to speak to this as well. Can you speak about the disappointing veto by Governor Newsom for the ethnic studies mandate?
I feel like the follow-up question that you give Robin Davis is actually, I think you captured it. The issue of white supremacy. I think all three panelists have really exemplified how these major, particularly statewide policy discussions are still really intertwined with this issue of white supremacy. And many people have actually have called the veto, regardless of the overwhelming support across the state, as an example of how how power, right? Like how a small number of people in a position of power can literally eliminate and decimate the will of the people. So, and we've seen it. I think all of our presenters today, quite frankly, spoke to that on various other issues. So ethnic studies and the AB 331 is actually, in fact, no different than what Dr. Herrera, Dr. Soto Pena were exemplifying with bilingual policy and what Dr. Sotero Lopez has laid out in terms of the treatment of immigrant children and youth.
Thank you. Now we have a question related to bilingual education. How do I get non-bilingual students and parents to accept and not feel left out of a bilingual friendly approach to teaching?
So I think there's some really cool movements that are happening right now with organizations pushing bilingual education to start with early childhood education. And that's bringing in all students regardless of their home language, right? I think we need to have more conversations of how to start younger so that it's already ingrained within our culture. So SEAL, it's a different organization. It's the SEAL Early Language, Sobrato Early Language, oh, I'm butchering this right now, Early Academic Language Organization. They focus in a lot on bilingual ed within ECE and then building a pipeline beyond. So that's one way. Luiz, go ahead.
Well, I think I want to go back to, you know, I mentioned Nelson Flores is currently working on a book, right, talking about how bilingual education moved away from this grassroots movement to a more sort of like, you know, looking at bilingual education as more of a asset-based sort of approach so that parents can be attracted to it. But then by doing that, it did take away from some of that original intent to really serve minoritized communities. So I do think it's really important to create, you know, to maintain those spaces to support the bilingualism of minoritized language speakers, but also to have those spaces for students who are not from minoritized language backgrounds, right? But really, this is a really tricky one for me because I do think that it's really important to prioritize that space first for minoritized linguistic or language speakers. And how can we encourage parents that are not from minoritized linguistic backgrounds to join bilingual education? Well, not just to look at it from this sort of, what is it? I don't know, neoliberal perspective, right? That of the benefits of bilingualism or all of this, which fine, we know all of that, but it's really about, you know, appreciating the richness of bilingualism, multilingualism, multiculturalism, and just really embracing just, you know, our sort of, I don't know, global citizenship, right? So I hope that you can approach and, you know, attract the support of families in that way and not just seeing it as just a benefit from, you know, just from a value added perspective, but just really thinking about it more globally and thinking about the connections just more broadly than just the interest of, like, you know, one family or one child, if that makes any sense at all.
Our next question is, what is your advice for current educators in a dual immersion setting who see a trend of students not seeing value in speaking Spanish? I hear students say, everything is in English, English is easier, and our president doesn't like people who speak Spanish.
I think I could start and then maybe another colleague wants to jump in, but I have that issue in my own household with my son. He is 7 and he is in a bilingual program now. And, you know, every once in a while, I think it's because he knows how to press my buttons. He'll say things like, oh no, I don't want to read that in Spanish. Oh, I don't want to do that in Spanish. Or I don't want to watch this in Spanish, you know, and and like, oh no, like how did this happen to me? You know, like we have all of the access in the world to to bilingual books, and we celebrate his bilingualism and his, it really encouraged the growth of his bilingual identity, and how can this happen, right? But so I think that's one way that I've been trying to do this, with my own child, as well as how I try to communicate this with my own pre-service teachers that are becoming bilingual teachers, is, well, we have to really take care of this bilingual identity and really nourish it. And we really have to think about how we can create this, how, Freire calls like this consciousness, right? And awareness of who you are and who your family history is, and the language, the importance of language to your cultural identity. And all of that makes who you are. And so it's important to consider it from that perspective, right? And to really nourish the sort of self-love, I guess. So I'll stop right there.
I think it's also important to note how children look at systems. So one thing that Dr. Lopez talked about was the idea that we live under a system of some white supremacy, and the policies and practices that they're experiencing on the day-to-day send the message of white supremacy and English only language. So it's battling that and making that also apparent and aware. And so building off of Freire, one thing that I do is I engage in a lot of problem posing methodologies. So I'll ask questions. Is it fair? What do you think about that? What do you feel that way? And I use the same books that were actually cited by Dr. Herrera and Dr. Soltero Lopez, with characters that undergo feeling of that isolation and that loss, and that alienation because of racism, and asking students, well, how do they feel? And then seeing if they empathize with those characters. And through that process of empathy, being able to identify, name, label those feelings, then me as a teacher in the position of power, validating those feelings, saying you're right to feel that way, and let's call out what's making you feel that way. And then from that, work towards a process of co-liberation, where then students start voicing the inequities that they see. So in one of some of the work that I've done with dual language schools, I've sat down with middle school students that were not granted the opportunity to be in dual language. But there was one teacher that tried to funnel them in through a pipeline in middle school because she identified their linguistic strengths, said you should be in this program because also let's be real, bilingual ed is also put into a magnet-like program fashion, right? And so she's trying to get them into that pipeline, but the school system and the barriers that were put into play rejected them from entering the program altogether, right? And so when I met with these students, they're like, I don't understand how I've been speaking this language my whole life and I'm not allowed in, but here's someone who started in kindergarten, doesn't speak half the language I can, but they're able to take advantage of these magnet programs. So there's only so much we can do to teach them. This really has to be a policy piece too, and pressuring our school districts to not perpetuate segregated education within bilingual education itself.
What I want to add really quickly, I echo both my colleagues, Dr. Herrera and Dr. Soto Pena. But as I mentioned when I presented, our children, very young, begin to read the world, right? And we underestimate how brilliant they are. And we definitely are operating still under English only, and it's seeped in everything. It's institutionalized, it's represented in our curriculum. But what I want to point out, which I always, talk about this quite a bit with my students in my courses, the importance of unpacking and decolonizing our own kind of internalization, right? As I mentioned, like I still struggle with the internalization of the shame of having been undocumented. And I think that is crucial, right? Even when talking about language. with the assignment, Dr. Herrera and I do the same assignment where we do the autobiografía. And what is revealed typically for a lot of the students in my course is one, a lack of kind of history, right? And not understanding why families made that conscious choice to only speak English. But beyond that, there's also an unpacking of viewing that native language as, I don't want to say deficit, but you know, not as worthy, not as important as English. And that's so important, right? For all of you that are educators, all of you actually in general, we need to pause to really reflect on these things, right? Internalize to the, you know, messages my colleagues just made, what discussions are happening in our homes, happened in our homes, what is being fed to us in media, right? All of that, right, is covert. And that's the thing that we think we're smart and we think, you know, we're woke, but sometimes all messages get delivered in very covert ways. So I wanted to also kind of think about those aspects as well.
Yeah, thank you, thank you. Another question looking into the future. From each of your perspectives, what are some of your thoughts on the future of teacher education when it comes to bilingual teachers and bilingual instruction?
I think I can start. My mentor, Ofelia Garcia, always says that the future of education is a bilingual education. And so I want to, you know, I want to think big. I want to make sure, or I'm working towards, you know, always becoming, right? And, you know, I think back about what Dr. Crowell shared last webinar. I think all of us are working always towards becoming anti-racist, right? And so I'm always also working towards becoming an advocate and with and for families to increase bilingual education or access to bilingual education. And so for me, the future of teacher education is increased access to bilingual education teacher preparation programs that is anti-racist, that is grounded on culturally and linguistically sustained pedagogies, and that really looks at language, again, like I shared earlier, from this sociolinguistic perspective, right? And not in a purist fashion, but really looks at the landscape, the sociolinguistic landscape of the communities, and really honor those and really bring those as part of just in developing the entire program itself. So that's one way that I see it.
So I am hopeful. I try to be hopeful. I got asked that question earlier today or yesterday of what are your prospects for the future. And as a mother, I don't have a choice to not be hopeful. Like I just have to, because if I'm not, then what's the point? So I need to be hopeful as survival. And then I am inserting myself in spaces. I consider myself a public scholar, so I try to get involved in places where they make policy and where policy is informed. And so I sit right now on a working group that looks at the bilingual authorization program standards in the state. And it's an awesome group of folks actually that are working, and we all have this vision and mission to create anti-racist bilingual education, right? And we're pushing hard. So will it get done? Maybe not. We've seen what 20 years, like it took 20 years to get to where we're at now. So I don't think it'll be done overnight, but I'm hopeful because we're having this conversation. People who are getting into those positions of power have these ideologies. Now it's just changing a system or dismantling the system altogether, right? And creating a new system where we see it reflective of our students, our families.
I too am hopeful, but honestly, I can't help but recognize how for ages we've resisted, we continue to nurture and pass down our native languages in our homes. And while the question really is looking at teacher education, I think, again, Dr. Soto Pena said it, like we're having these webinars, an opportunity to also have you're not familiar with our Enseñamos en el Valle Central initiative, to check us out. That's really part of what we're doing, right? Is cultivating our own bilingual Latinx teachers in the Central Valley. But outside of school, right, we're gonna be resilient. We're gonna still nurture our languages. It's just sad, right? I'm hopeful, but it's sad that up until now, despite Prop 58, we're still heavily under English only instruction. But again, this is an opportunity to call on you, our audience, right? Teacher educators, veteran teachers, to assist us in shaping and changing, right, that rhetoric, that framing in our schools, right, locally, state level, nationally. It's important for all of our voices to be elevated, right, to share the importance of bilingual education.
Thank you. I'm not sure if any of you can address this, but can you speak briefly about bilingual education in other languages besides English and Spanish? This could be locally or across the United States. How are other bilingual education programs, I guess, being offered?
So I can begin. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to share, for the bilingual authorization program at Fresno State, we have the bilingual authorization that's offered in Spanish and Hmong. So if you're interested, again, please email me and I'll guide you through that process.
I was just going to share that even though I grew up in California, I spent 12 years in New York. I started my career in teaching in New York City in public school, in the Department of Education there. And bilingual education there was never outlawed like here. So we did have, it wasn't a major, by far we still had ENL and ESL type of programs, English only programs, but we did have bilingual programs throughout the city. And the city is the largest school district in the nation. It serves over 1.1 million students. And so we have, or I still say we because I'm like never leaving in my heart, I guess. But we have programs in all kinds of languages, including Bengali, Arabic, French. And so by far, Spanish is the most common because it's still the majority. In terms of like the population, they're still the largest need, but there are bilingual programs across the nation, particularly in New York City, that are not just English and Spanish. So yeah, so I would definitely invite you to check those out. And also CUNY NYSEB is a wonderful resource that you can find. I'll put it on the website, on the chat here, CUNYNYSEB.org. It's a wonderful resource that you can tap into for various things such as translanguaging guides, as well as webinars and other resources to support the learning of bilingual education and how to support just bilingualism in general. So I'll add it in the chat.
So with California, there are a lot of diverse language models and programs depending on the regions, right? Cultural context. So like you'll go to Anaheim or Fullerton, they have a lot of Korean programs. If you go to San Francisco Bay Area, you'll find a lot of Mandarin or Cantonese programs. Fresno has Hmong programs. Then I even think that there's authorizations for ASL, American Sign Language. And so there are a lot of different authorizations for various language program models. But then it goes back to the question of who feels prepared and who is prepared to be able to add on an authorization when they're a credential if they've spent their entire lifetime only learning in the English language, right? So there's a gap of 20 years that we need to catch up to. And so when it comes to preparing our teachers or even having more diverse language program models, I know that programs and IHEs or institutions of higher education are struggling to have people like us, teachers, teach in those target languages, which then leads districts to struggling to find teachers, right? So there needs to be like an overhaul of really looking at the benefits of becoming a teacher, because it doesn't mean that we don't have the linguistic resources. We have folks that are multilingual across all sectors, but the question is, why are they not going into education too, right? And we really need to examine that piece too, of looking at our profession and that as a society value the assets that education and teaching brings to the forefront. And I think that would be one way to kind of help build that base of bilingual ed beyond Spanish.
All right, thank you all. We are going to now thank all of our panelists for their time. And I'd like to just invite for a few minutes Dr. Herrera to speak briefly about your book, if possible, just to let our audience know. And we'll talk about our next webinar in the next week.
Sure, thank you. So En Comunidad is for teachers and pre-service teachers, as well as teacher educators. And for anybody that's really interested in learning how to center the voices and experiences of bilingual students. In this book, we definitely focus on bilingual Latinx students, because both Carla España, my co-author, and I are bilingual Latinx. And it was really a way to, this offered us a space to reflect on our own experiences and our own lives and our own education, and how that informed our journey through schooling, through our teacher preparation, through our teaching, as well as to pursuing this doctoral in bilingual education, doctoral studies in bilingual education, and now teacher educators, both of us, in bilingualism in education. And so the books are really about asking readers to think about their language ideologies, and it really deconstruct them and explore them and consider how that informs their practice. It also takes you through a variety of ways to enact pedagogies that are culturally and linguistically sustaining. And so we do this through poetry, we do this through narratives. We do this through looking at social justice issues and how we can really bring that into the classroom. And so, yeah, so I invite you to check out our Padlet. I'll add it again so you can get an idea of what it looks like, and also has a ton of resources that are meant to accompany this book. And as well as all kinds of resources that we use, multimodal text that we include in the book as well. So yeah, so we'll be, I guess, choosing 2 people from the webinar exit survey participants, and I'll be mailing these out to you. All right, good luck.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Herrera. We're going back a few slides. So if we can go back to webinar 4, as Dr. Goff mentioned, we'll be closing up this webinar, and hope that, well, first of all, thank all of you, thank the panelists and the presenters for just bringing your authentic self today to this conversation, and hope you'll join us for the next webinar, number 4. We'll look at anti-racism across disciplines and content area. So again, RSVP, we'll put this on Facebook Live. Please fill out the survey. Your information has just been so insightful so far. And again, don't miss out, get one of these free books. So thank you all again. Thank you to the presenters, to all of you watching on Facebook Live. We really appreciate you being here, and we look forward to seeing you at the next one. Bye-bye.